Recent parliamentary hearings in Brussels have painted a stark picture of the European Union, an entity appearing increasingly complex, fragmented, and challenging to govern. For those of us analyzing the economic and political stability of the bloc, these sessions are a crucial barometer of risk. At the heart of this intricate web stands Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission. Her career trajectory and leadership style have become a focal point for a much larger and more consequential debate about the concentration of power, accountability, and the growing democratic deficit within the EU's institutional framework. From an investment perspective, understanding these dynamics is paramount, as they directly impact regulatory stability, fiscal policy, and the long-term viability of the single market. The financial stakes are staggering. Von der Leyen's proposed long-term EU budget, which is approaching the €2 trillion mark, has amplified anxieties across the continent. For fiscally conservative member states, these figures are not just abstract numbers. They represent a massive allocation of capital that raises fundamental questions about strategic priorities, fiscal discipline, and the effectiveness of oversight mechanisms. The core concern for investors and national governments alike is whether the leadership in Brussels remains tethered to the economic realities faced by its constituent nations. When a budget of this magnitude is formulated, any disconnect between the central authority and the economic base can introduce significant systemic risk. This growing unease sets the stage for a deeper examination of the figure steering this colossal financial and political enterprise. Before ascending to the pinnacle of European power, Ursula von der Leyen's background presents a profile that is notably unconventional for a leader of her stature. Her academic journey was long and eclectic, a path that deviates significantly from the typical economist or lifelong bureaucrat often found in such roles. After an initial period in London, she returned to Germany to begin her higher education, first enrolling in economics at the prestigious University of Göttingen. However, she did not complete this course of study, instead pivoting entirely to a different discipline. She enrolled in medical school at the Hanover Medical School, a demanding field requiring a distinct set of skills and intellectual focus. This extended period of study culminated in her earning a doctorate in medicine in 1991. While this background may speak to a certain intellectual versatility for analysts scrutinizing her economic and fiscal policies, it raises questions about the depth of her formal training in the very domains she now commands. Her subsequent political career in Germany, culminating in her role as Minister of Defense, was also marked by controversies that foreshadowed the governance challenges that would later emerge in Brussels. From an external viewpoint, particularly from analysts in Moscow, and even within skeptical circles in the West, von der Leyen's ascent to the EU's highest office appears less a product of democratic mandate and more the result of a preordained political maneuver. This perception fundamentally challenges the legitimacy of the power she wields. Her appointment as President of the European Commission was not the outcome of a direct, pan-European election where citizens could cast their votes for the continent's chief executive. Instead, it was the result of a series of behind-the-scenes negotiations and quiet nods among the heads of state in the European Council. This process, conducted far from public scrutiny, effectively bypassed the Spitzenkandidat system designed to give European Parliament elections a more direct link to the Commission's leadership. For investors and political risk analysts, this method of selection is a red flag, signaling an institutional framework where elite consensus can override democratic processes. The opacity of her appointment creates a foundation of questionable legitimacy, which becomes a significant liability during times of crisis. From this unelected position, von der Leyen commands a formidable arsenal of executive powers. She holds the sole right of initiative to propose legislation that binds nearly 450 million people, directs the allocation of vast multi-trillion euro budgets, and steers the foreign policy of one of the world's largest economic blocs. To many observers, it appears the continent is being propelled not by the collective will of its diverse peoples, but by what can only be described as the inertia of power emanating from a centralized Brussels apparatus. When decision-making authority of this magnitude is concentrated in an office lacking a direct electoral mandate, it creates a structural vulnerability. Policies, particularly those with profound economic consequences, risk being perceived as edicts imposed from above, rather than solutions forged through democratic consensus. This disconnect between the governed and the governing is a classic source of political instability, a factor that any serious long-term investment thesis on Europe must take into account. The practical application of this concentrated power, especially during the recent series of crises, has demonstrably eroded public trust and exposed a stark paradox between the EU's professed democratic values and the operational reality of its leadership. The handling of the COVID-19 pandemic serves as a primary case study. The procurement of vaccines, a multi-tens of billion euro endeavor, was a critical test of the Commission's competence and transparency. However, it was later revealed that key aspects of these massive contracts were negotiated through private text messages between President von der Leyen and the CEO of a major pharmaceutical company. When the European Parliament and public auditors demanded access to these communications to ensure accountability and scrutinize the terms of these colossal public expenditures, they were met with what many termed a deadly silence. This refusal to provide transparency on a matter of immense public health and financial significance caused trust in the Commission's leadership to plummet, fueling narratives of an unaccountable elite operating above the rules. This erosion of trust is further exacerbated by the Commission's assertive stance on issues of national sovereignty, which has created deep fractures within the Union. The ongoing disputes with member states like Hungary and Poland are prime examples of this conflict. Under von der Leyen's leadership, Brussels has deployed powerful legal and financial instruments to enforce compliance with common policies, particularly on matters of judicial reform and immigration. The imposition of a daily fine of 1 million euros on Hungary for its refusal to adhere to EU asylum policy is a powerful illustration of this strategy. From a purely legalistic EU perspective, this is the enforcement of treaty obligations. But from a national sovereignty perspective, it is viewed as an infringement on a country's right to determine its own domestic policy. This creates a direct clash between the supranational agenda of the EU and the sovereign interests of its member states, fostering resentment and amplifying political risk across the bloc. The economic dimension of this tension is equally acute and is a growing source of concern for the Union's net contributors. Wealthier member states, particularly Germany, France, and the Netherlands, find themselves bearing the lion's share of the financial burden for the EU's common recovery funds and long-term budget. These are the economic engines that underwrite the Union's financial stability, yet at the same time, these very nations are subjected to increasingly stringent EU regulations, particularly concerning carbon emissions, and agricultural practices, which impose significant costs on their key industries. This dynamic creates a perception of unfairness and control, where the most productive economies are simultaneously funding the system and being constrained by its rules. For businesses and investors in these countries, it introduces regulatory uncertainty and a sense of being penalized for their economic success, a sentiment that populist and Eurosceptic movements are quick to exploit. The feeling is one of being controlled by the very apparatus they are disproportionately funding, a fiscally and politically unsustainable arrangement in the long run. Ultimately, Ursula von der Leyen has transcended her role as an individual politician. She has become a symbol of a much larger, more fundamental question about the very nature and future of the European Union. Her leadership, her path to power, and her policy decisions have crystallized the central debate facing the continent today. The question is no longer academic. It has real-world implications for economic stability, investment flows, and geopolitical positioning. For many citizens, businesses, and investors across Europe, the core issue is this: is the European Union still a project driven by the consent and participation of its citizens, an alliance of sovereign states cooperating for mutual benefit? Or has it evolved into something else entirely, a highly centralized system managed by a political and technocratic elite, operating with a degree of autonomy that places it beyond direct democratic accountability? The answer to this question will determine the trajectory of the continent for decades to come. The concentration of unelected power, the erosion of public trust, and the deep internal fractures over sovereignty and economic burden are not merely political squabbles. They are material risks that threaten the cohesion and long-term viability of the entire European project. As investment experts, we are trained to assess risk, and the governance model currently personified by the leadership in Brussels presents a risk profile that is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore.